So the history of resource use has been to have intellectual tools that help us discover new resources, but also visualization tools so we can help actually implement some of those ideas. So when you think about this, map making and Mercator projection and globes helped people explore all around the world, and they could go places and come back and found new resources. So this was a big advance. And so it wasn't just thinking that the world was shaped differently, it was actually having a map to be able to show people what you were going to do and to be able to find your way back. There's other examples of that, such as systems dynamics tools like we saw in week 3 and 4. Those were used to project into the future and project resource depletion versus population growth. The famous report put out by the Club of Rome said that unless you start tapering down resource consumption, you're going to have crashes. And this was a very controversial topic. But again, using a dynamic tool with the visualization, not just the theory behind it, got a lot more attention. Another source of resource exploration is tomography, and that's the exploration of three-dimensional surfaces. It's three-dimensional volumes. So for example, finding oil and other resources underground use tomography, and now we know that more as it applied in the medical fields, but the original purpose was to be able to find these deep oil reserves or mineral reserves. And what we're going to be talking about today is in week 6 are using networks, and we're going to visualize these networks in sort of a simplified manner, but the visualization of them is going to help us look at those resources differently. And along with using a systems approach, network approach, it allows us to look at different factors and consider both the sort of mass and energy flow that we see from systems, but all the other sort of interactions that we can get at with the network view. So in week 5, we're going to look at the network view of food webs and look at the importance of biodiversity and what we can do with ecosystem management. In week 6, we're going to be looking at landscape networks, sort of on the landscape, what happens when you have fragmentation or how you can use corridors to overcome that. So those are both a network view of this problem. Now in today's in this week's work, we're going to be looking at some things that repeat from last module, such as complex systems. Remember, Jared Diamond talked about these factors that combine to make a complex system, and those can lead to ecosystem collapse. So one of the things about this is that when we look at complex view of the world, we're not focusing so much just on one particular factor, or it's how everything works together. And so maybe if people took that sort of view, they might catch some of the trends and some of the messiness in these ecosystems. So for example, sometimes you wonder, and I think Jared Diamond talks about this, what was the guy thinking that cut down the last palm tree? Well, he actually didn't have to cut down the last palm tree. He only had to cut down the tree that put that whole population between its below its minimum viable population. That's a much more sort of nuanced view. There could have been a very large stand of trees, but they just couldn't replace themselves after a certain amount of insult. And that's, again, what we're going to be talking about, this idea of resilience and how populations and communities, ecosystems can respond. The main points in this week's work, this module, is going to be looking at going from a food pyramid, just like material and energy flow, to a food web, where you have increases in the complexity, and the interaction between the organisms is actually a key piece. We're going to show that networks have some recognizable features that we can describe and use that as a way to get at some of our understanding of these networks. And we're going to focus on resilience, which can be understood from a network approach very much more easily than any other approach. And this is the idea that when a system is stressed, how far can you stress a system and it can still return to that same structure. So this idea of resilience is very useful for us. And then we're going to look at some examples of how we can work with natural complexity and the food webs in particular this week, looking at a couple examples, and there's also a couple more examples in the videos. So with that, I'd like to get going on today's on this week's work.